From the Great Basin to the Rockies to the four corners of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. Dwayne Benson here for KMMU Main Street Media, Utah, coming to you live. We're streaming on YouTube, Rumble, X, Twitter, and our website, kmmu.org. Please join our host, Dan Fillmore, for Let's Talk Utah's Dan the Eagle. Hello, Utah. Today, our host Dan will be talking to Vaughn Hokanson mainly about education, and we've got some related news from the Utah legislative session, which concluded on March 7th. The Senate and House passed 582 bills during this session. Education is always a hot topic for Utahns whose population age is the lowest in the U.S. 14 of the bills were directed at education. 5 of the bills were related to higher education, and 9 were directed at primary and secondary schools. Here's just a taste. You may want to read the full text of these. HB 267 bans collective bargaining for public sector unions. HB 447 provides $65 million in one-time funds to support schools and school districts with technical education. HB 260, the first credential program for high school students, will provide opportunities for industry-recognized credentials for high school students. HB 157 requires Utah's Office of Energy Development to establish the Energy, Education, and Workforce Development Advisory Group for K-12. There's a mouthful. HB 455, the Utah Fits All Scholarship, has some new funding guidelines and accountability guardrails. Students 5 to 11 years old will have access to $4,000 a year, while those 12 to 18 years old will get $6,000. Private school students are still eligible for $8,000 a year. SB 178, no cell phones, smartwatches, or other devices will be allowed in schools. HB 104 requires schools to teach firearm safety beginning as early as kindergarten. HB 77 prohibits a government entity or employee of a government entity from displaying a flag in or on the grounds of governmental property, except the U.S. flag, the Utah state flag, the official flag of another country or state. HB 100 provides free school lunch for students who qualify for reduced school lunch under federal guidelines. It's a lot of stuff. Take it away, Dan.
Well, it is a lot of stuff, as Dwayne mentioned, but we are here with one of the best guests that could ever be here. It's with Vaughn Hokanson. He is going to be walking us through all of that. Before we get into this, though, please make sure that you like this video, subscribe to our channel. We are streaming live on X, YouTube, and Rumble on Main Street Media, Utah. If you look that up, Main Street Media, on any of those platforms, you'll be able to find us easily. Or go to kmmu.org to subscribe and to get our weekly updates on when we have shows. My show is every Wednesday at around 4:30, and we are so excited to be getting into it today with Vaughn Hokanson. He is currently the largest private child care district manager in the entire state of Utah. So he is the district manager for ABC Great Beginnings. He is also the co-founder of Apex Gardening and Mott and Bailey Marketing. Did I say that right, Vaughn?
Yeah, that's right. And to be clear, I'm the district manager for the largest private childcare company. It's not my company. I work with them. It's a company that has 15 schools in Utah and another 6 in Arizona.
Awesome. But you are the district manager. You're
the Northern District. Yep.
Nice. Very, very cool. Well, we're really excited to have you. Like I always say, if you want to call in and ask me or Vaughn any questions, you can. The number is 385-899-2134. Again, that's 385-899-2134. So without further ado, we are going to jump right into it with our man, Vaughn. And so Vaughn, you, like you said, you are the district manager of the Northern District for the largest private child care company in the entire state. Is that right?
Yeah, and let me also throw in a caveat here, Dan. I want to be clear that in my speaking to you on your podcast, I'm speaking for myself. I'm not representing the company in any of my opinions or any of the things that I'm sharing. It's a great company to work for, but I don't want to be construed as being like a public spokesperson for ABC Great Beginnings. It just happens to be the place that I'm professionally working, and it provides me an extra lens of insight along with all the other experiences that I've had in the education and political arena to talk about some of these topics that we're going to explore in the realm of education.
Yeah, perfect. So what kind of got you into, I mean, getting into childcare is, part of education, but it sounds like you have a lot of other experience with education. Give us an idea of kind of your history with education in the state of Utah.
Yeah, thanks. I was born here in Utah. My mom and dad raised me until I was 13 in the Weber County area. So part of my early education was in inner city Ogden schools. And back in the early 80s, when I was a kindergarten first and second grader, I was at T.O. Smith Elementary. And during that period, Ogden's inner city schools were fairly rough. I remember walking to school with my brother, and one of the kiddos that was walking with us was a few years older, picked up a handgun that he found buried in the dirt on the trail to school and was talking about taking it to school. There were a lot of kind of gang related feeling type things that were happening in my elementary school. Kids were talking about beating each other up, and I remember hearing the F word in the hallways pretty regularly. There were, some physical and sexual things that were happening, and my parents were just really concerned because that wasn't the way that they wanted me raised, to be exposed to a lot of that stuff. And I don't think it was the fault of the educators or any one administrator or anything like that. It was just a symptom of a system that was struggling. And frankly, those are very similar things that you might hear at some of the schools in the state now, but we also have additional and even more exacerbated problems. So my parents decided early on that they were going to be early pioneers in the homeschooling movement. They listened to they were LDS, and they listened to Ezra Taft Benson's son Reed Benson speak at a conference at BYU and kind of on tour a few things, and they prayed about it, and they decided, well, we're going to homeschool our kids. So in second grade, I was pulled out of T.O. Smith Elementary School in inner city Ogden, and mom and dad kind of started that whole process. It was really a different thing back in the 80s. There were only a few thousand homeschool students in the entire state. Right now, there's many, many, many more thousands than there were back then. And I think that part of why homeschooling has flourished as much as it had in the last decade is partly COVID, but it's partly just that parents are seeing time and time again that certain needs are not being met in the public schools, and the public school system is struggling. So I think that kind of start is really what laid the foundation for me. I didn't want to be an educator all growing up, but by the time I was 16, I had decided I wanted to be an educator. In my early years, I wanted to flee society and live in the Amazon jungle or the Alaskan tundra and be a mountain man. My hero,
as we all do at
Davy
like the age
Crockett,
of 10 or 11, right?
Yeah. So I tried to push back any academic work that I could in my early elementary years after I was pulled out to be homeschooled. So I learned how to trap, and I learned how to shoot a gun and sleep under the stars and build, grass huts. And I got my Eagle Scout eventually, did a lot of Cub Scouting and a lot of those things. So I grew up kind of wild and free. And then I learned to love reading. My mom read to me all the time, and I started picking up books. And when I was about 15, I started reading Anne of Green Gables, which is usually, thought to be kind of a girly book. But I fell in love with the education story of Anne Shirley, and she had a great teacher. And I thought, well, that's really amazing how she transformed her life trajectory. And for whatever reason, that novel inspired me to want to be an educator. And so I started working on my academics. I eventually crammed for the ACT, got a good score, went to university, did a couple of years. I realized I didn't like being told what to study, because all during my high school years, I'd just go to the library and I'd get a laundry basket, fill it up with all the books that I wanted to read, and I'd journal and I'd do math, kind of just guided, but not really in a structured class. And so eventually I got in my undergrad to the point where I said, hey, I'm not getting the freedom that I want in my education, so I'm going to go find a school where I can design my own path in my undergrad. So I had finished about 60 credits. I left undergrad and planned to go to Marlborough College in Vermont, where they let you design your own second and third years and senior years of college. I didn't end up making it there because of the cost of attendance. And so after a few years of coaching gymnastics and working outside of traditional paths, kind of like a couple gap years, I guess you could say, I ended up actually going back to the school that I started studying with, and that was Brigham Young University, Idaho. And they had created, in my time that I was gone, an interdisciplinary studies program. And so I jumped back in and I graduated with a bachelor's degree in English, philosophy, and child development. And my whole senior capstone as a senior in college was to work with a startup micro school in Idaho Falls, Idaho. And so I was coaching gymnastics, working in a micro school, finishing up a degree with the intent to use that degree to go into education, entrepreneurship, and starting schools. And what I discovered working with the micro school that I was working with is that their biggest hurdles don't come from being able to instruct in the classroom or having clients to teach. They come from battling zoning laws and public policy issues, local school boards.
And
all
sorry to cut you off, but when you say micro schools, what does that exactly mean?
Yeah, thank you. I get that question a lot. A micro school is essentially a private school that is smaller than 150 students. So it's essentially a startup private school. It's not, I like to think of them as the bridge between home schools and private schools, or even home schools and public schools.
So they're just smaller private schools, basically.
Yep. Okay. And there were not many micro schools to speak of at all prior to, I think it's been in the last 15 to 20 years that this movement has really taken off. And there's some people who have really gotten behind the micro school movement who are heavy hitters. Laura Sandeffer and Jeff Sandeffer, they're from Harvard with their education. Texas was the state that they started in, but they created a system of micro schools that's now called Acton Academies, and you can franchise an Acton Academy, and they'll give you a lot of the pieces to start a micro school. Because I'll be clear, like going into educating not only your own children but other children in your community is a massive undertaking that very few appreciate who haven't walked that walk. And so there's a lot of different companies out there and individuals who are trying to make this process easier.
Yeah.
And we're
gonna, I love that you're getting into this. We're gonna get into all that here in a sec, with all like the specifics of policy and stuff like that. I've got it here written down.
Yeah. So I'll scoot back.
Yeah.
So I was working in that environment, in that micro school world, and I realized, okay, a lot of these issues for these people who are trying to start and run these schools are not issues of being able to teach, but there are issues of policy and zoning and business and those types of things. And so I realized if I really want to follow this path after undergrad, I need to find a way to put myself in that arena. And so my wife and I decided that I would go to law school with the intent to get involved in education policy and education entrepreneurship. So I graduated with that bachelor's in English philosophy, child development, and went right to work for corporate childcare. There was a company in Ogden called Bright Horizons. It's one of the biggest childcare companies in the world. They have campuses all over the US. And what their model is they partner with major corporations and provide in-house childcare. So I was working at the IRS complex and taking care of the kids whose parents were, doing your taxes. So
yeah.
I did that and coached gymnastics while my wife finished her bachelor's in early childhood special education and started teaching in the public schools. She did that for 6 months before our first son was born, and she decided never again. So we have linked up as a couple with this journey of like, hey, we're going to start micro school. So I studied for the studied for the LSAT, took it twice over 2 years, got close to the score that I wanted. My dream was always to go to BYU Law, and I was Caucasian male from Utah, and I was the median LSAT score. Didn't get in either of the times I applied. So I networked around. I found a law school in Ohio that would give me almost a full ride scholarship with the scores that I had. I went out to Ohio with my young family and got my law degree there. During the course of that experience, I worked in a lot of inner city schools. I networked with charter schools. I took MBA classes on entrepreneurship, got into kind of the startup founder networks of my law school and graduate university. And then I also networked and applied to come and do a visiting semester at BYU Law. So I was able to make it back to Utah through that. I came in 2018 and did a semester where I took all the kind of unique to BYU Law courses. They have a lot of, because BYU is a religious school, they have a lot of like ancient law of the Book of Mormon and New Testament and Old Testament and leadership. So I took a lot of those courses, and then I also took First Amendment and religious liberty law while I was at BYU. And then I went back, did my final semester in Ohio, graduated, and then came back to Utah with a job that I found while I was at BYU Law. And that job was to work with Congressman Chris Stewart's son, Lance, who was owning, running, and starting education companies here in Utah. And so I started for him. We built a franchise of tutoring in Utah County. It was a Canadian-based company that we got the franchise rights for, and we ran that to a profitable place, and then COVID hit. So I was in my first year. I graduated from law school at May of 2019, came out to Utah, started building this tutoring company. It was private in-home tutoring, and then COVID hit and totally shut down our operation. So Lance liked me, I liked him. We decided to keep building together. So he bought a gymnastics gym in Heber to keep me going with something. I built that company while also helping start a micro school, running 2 childcare centers, a trampoline park, and trying to keep the tutoring company alive after COVID. Once we got big enough, I was his COO and was operating 5 LLCs, and it just was becoming too much for my growing family to do all the commuting. I was traveling from Heber City to Syracuse, Utah, back to Utah County. My wife and I prayed about it, and we decided that we would launch off on our own, and we started our own micro school that we've named Apex Garden. That's been operating now for 2 years, profitably and successfully. And while we were starting that, I needed additional income. And so I got involved in some politics. I helped run a couple congressional campaigns. I ran my own state Senate campaign, served in the Republican Party a lot, networked with a lot of the candidates who were running for state office, and ended up starting the marketing company that I have. It's Mott and Bailey Marketing. And that's primarily a company that we use to leverage communication for political causes, but also to help local small businesses. And it's what hosts all the websites for the companies that I run.
So both of the things that you are part of, or I guess, because the first thing you said was that you were not actually the one who was running that one organization that you mentioned.
Yeah, so I'll get you
the
ABC Great Beginnings.
ABC Great Beginnings. So that's not yours, but Apex Garden, that's you and your wife's own micro school. Is that correct?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
And then the Mott and Bailey marketing is for all marketing purposes.
Yeah, and it's a partnership with two guys who have got a lot of experience in the tech world, and we built it so that we could essentially help with some of the political and entrepreneurial ventures that are in our communities. So
I think you mentioned something interesting about homeschooling, because throughout my entire life, homeschooling has basically been looked at by society, by myself, by people I know, as kind of a weird thing. Like only weird kids homeschool, only like the very strange, awkward children and like the weird parents.
Which was very much the narrative from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s.
Exactly. But I feel like today that narrative has absolutely changed. It's shifted dramatically.
Yep.
We're going to get into all that. Before we get into that, though, we're going to just do a little ad break, I guess. You're listening now to KMMU Main Street Media Utah. You can find us on YouTube, X, and on our website, kmmu.org. Look us up, Main Street Media Utah. You can give us a call at any time. You can talk to me. You can talk to Vaughn about any specific questions that you might have about micro schools, education policy in the state of Utah. We're going to be diving into it, every last little detail. So, Vaughn, like I was mentioning before, I think that COVID was probably the tipping point where people were starting to see kind of what teachers were teaching their kids. Kids were coming home and saying that they were a different gender. People are realizing that the amount of education their children are receiving is not very good. And there's been a large push from conservative groups to make sure that there is a large emphasis not only on homeschooling, but alternatives to public schooling. And so it's been interesting. I guess my question is to you is, why do you think, because that's my opinion, I think that all those things converging kind of change people's opinions. Do you think that the opinion is changing, and do you think that it will keep going? Or kind of what's your general thoughts on societal shifts on the idea of homeschooling?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's something that I've thought about a lot. So I was very much one of those kids who everybody thought, oh, you must be the weird kid because you're homeschooled. And granted, I think there are some things socially that are slightly different when you're not exposed to a larger peer group. But my parents did a really good job of socializing me through church youth activities, scouting, a lot of community. I did 4-H. I did scouting through not just my church. I did it through like a community troop in Nebraska. And so I was very actively involved in a lot of things that gave me social experience. But by and large, you're right that stigma has existed for a long time. And I do think that we've had a big shift. However, I think with that shift, we've also laid bare some of the real problems with homeschooling. And I think that's where microschooling comes in. One of the big problems with homeschooling is that you have resource-starved children frequently when it comes to higher academic material and instruction. So when I was growing up, I didn't ever have somebody to expose me to higher order algebra or calculus. And I was really interested. I wanted to gain some of that knowledge, but I didn't have access to resources. I didn't have a laboratory. I didn't have a school newspaper. I didn't have a facility where I didn't have athletics. And so a lot of these kids who were homeschooled early on, they may have received a lot of love of learning and some good moral instruction, but they were missing academic pieces frequently. And so that became something that parents who were leaving the system saying, well, we need something better than this, than all the weight's on me. Like mom and dad, maybe they don't have the elite education that they feel like they would want to give their kids the instruction in topics that will make them.
Yeah, I've thought about, like, as a parent, would I ever homeschool? And I think I would be horrible at it, like just terrible. And so, like you said, like it's not easy.
Yeah, and so I think that's and as a result, there have also been real problems. I mean, one of the things that I'm really passionate about is protecting kids generally when it comes to all the different forms of abuse that exist in our modern society. And if you have a bad apple that says, well, I'm just going to send in a waiver and keep my kid at home, if you're a really bad apple, you can do all kinds of horrible things. And there have been cases, and those tend to catch the news. You know, it's like, hey,
Sure.
there's this family of 11 in California that kept half of the kids in the basement chained to beds, and they were
Right.
you know, tortured and abused or whatever
Right.
the case. Or you might have the case of the really extremist, conservative Baptist people. I love Baptists, so this is not, I just know there was one sect that they did a lot of homeschooling and their kids were being radicalized to go out and, you know, hold posters and protest soldiers coming home from wars and telling people you're going to go to hell. And, you know, so there, and then, you know, you have the Amish communities and all these things that some of them have great people and a lot of great intentions, but you do have a tendency when you have unregulated homeschooling to be able to kind of push whatever you want in your small group or in the parental, you know, family. You always have the story of the kid who didn't learn to speak English; they just learned to speak Klingon, right? And so, because the parents only spoke Klingon to the kid at home.
But, is that real?
Yeah, that's real. So,
oh my gosh!
So,
at least speak a useful language.
so you know, these things are out there, and this begs the question for legislators and for policymakers. You know, how do we balance all of these societal needs with the good and the bad? Because on the flip side, you have the amazing moms who homeschool their kids, gave everything to get them the best education, because I just talked about all the bad, but there's tons of good, like homeschoolers winning spelling bees, homeschoolers getting hired by Google with, you know, like crazy math skills. And so there's like, yeah, there's some great outcomes and there's some really scary, horrible outcomes. So how do we balance all this, and how do we create policy that fosters an environment where there's some accountability for helping kids meet standards, but we're also not like choking out the entrepreneurial spirit of the education that's happening. And then, you know, parents, a large quadrant of parents want to pull their kids out of public education because they're worried about federal policy and, you know, like the idea that we're going to be data mining our kids, putting them on paths towards the education that the government thinks they should have. We're going to be introducing social emotional learning. We're going to be starting an indoctrination process that will lead them towards, you know.
And those arguments resonate with me a lot,
right?
Because there have been examples even in just our state of Utah of teachers saying things to students and pushing like political agendas onto our students, where we are not consenting to these things. And as a parent, you get nervous about those things. So,
well, and in Washington, you have a federal lobby that's really propped up by Big Pharma, and Big Pharma looks at a kid who's encouraged to transition as a, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollar customer over their lifetime. And so you have that to factor in as well. And so there's just all of these really,
not to mention teachers unions who lose money as students choose alternatives, right?
Yeah.
So and that's the question that I wanted to come to was, what are some of, like, because you mentioned earlier that it was surprising to you that the issues with public schooling and micro schools was not that there weren't enough teachers or students. There's plenty of teachers, plenty of students. The problem was that policy and zoning and business interests were all getting in the way. So not from a federal perspective, because that's a whole can of worms that, I mean, we don't want to open up. But just in the state of Utah, what do you think some of the problems are? And do you think that any of those problems have been solved by the legislation that was mentioned in the news brief?
Yeah. Well, that's great. Really, really great question. And I want to start out what I'm saying by prefacing it with, I actually love our public schools. And when I say that, I mean, there's real value to providing education for children who are in a position where they would receive no education if it was left up to their family.
Sure.
And the reality is that I would say a good 50, I don't know, if I had to guess, I'd say 50% to maybe slightly more, maybe slightly less of our families in Utah cannot functionally afford or manage homeschooling all of their children, as well as keeping up with their mortgage or their rent payment, as well as the job. It just, if we were say, okay, we're just going to shut down all our public schools, the number of students who would be left in this state of really sad despair would be a large number. And so I think that's another thing that we really have to keep in mind here, because I know so many great teachers who are in the public school system, and families who have generationally, chosen teaching as their profession, who've made tremendous impact on students throughout the state. And
I'm a product of public schooling, and I can say that I had a pretty good education because of that. And like my parents wouldn't have been able to do it.
The hard thing is that all of those good teachers feel like they're being attacked when the system is messed with, So some of this latest legislation is really making a tremendous impact in educational opportunities for micro schoolers, homeschoolers. And we're talking about the Utah Fits All scholarship. We're talking about some rezoning things that have happened. So not this session, but last session, they changed zoning laws so that you could run a private micro school in a residential neighborhood as long as you limited the number of enrollees to 15 students. So that's what allowed my wife and I to start and run our micro school without having to go through a tremendous amount of expensive zoning and building hurdles. Now, that being said, your ability to impact a large number of students is very limited with that size, but it gives those who want to innovate enough breathing room that there's a way to do it, and some funding that comes from the state. And the reality is, there are a lot of students who are not being well served by the public school system, not because of the public school system itself, but because of the nature of the child. So you have kids with ADD, ADHD, you have kids with autism, you have kids with dyslexia or
kids who want to go live in the woods.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you also have, some schools that are struggling. You may be specific. The kid lands in the worst classroom in the district for some reason, and parents are like, well, so the frustrating thing for me as an education entrepreneur is seeing this kind of tension between these wonderful public school teachers and these wonderful education entrepreneurs like myself. I like calling myself a wonderful education entrepreneur, but I know that my wife and I are doing what we're doing because we love kids and we love helping the education ecosystem in the state thrive and grow to a more elevated state where our kids are getting to 18, 19, 20, and they've got the tools and resources and education pieces that they need to thrive in today's environment. And I really believe that it's going to take a collaboration between both those innovators and entrepreneurs like myself and the system itself as it has existed to try and, build something that's holistically good for all the students in the state.
It seems as if from just the legislative, and we're going to go through like point by point. I want to talk about each one. It seems like the entrepreneurs and the people who want it are getting along with those who are making policy. It does seem like that convergence is getting closer and closer for us to be able to have truly an open system where you can educate your child pretty much in any way that you want. And so we're going to go through each individual one. So the first one that I want to talk about is HB 267. This is the one by Jordan Tusher from South Jordan. It bans union collective bargaining for all public sector unions. This one is a massive bill. This is a monster. Public school unions are, I think, because I worked the legislative session back in 2021 for Senator Fillmore, my uncle, and I remember dealing with public unions, with public sector unions, especially the teachers unions. They are so powerful. Like they are immensely powerful, and they don't want their money to be touched. So, what does 267 HB 267 actually do, Vaughn? And are you a fan?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm getting like goosebumps on my back, because it's just like such a delicate thing to walk. You know, you were right in saying that it's the UHEA, right? Or what's the acronym for the?
I want to say it's the UAE, but I could be off.
Yeah. So the public school lobby, it has been historically one of the most powerful political influences in the state. And to take away their collective bargaining rights, I have so many teacher friends who are just completely up in arms about this. And it's again like from their perspective, you know, we're just hurting public education. We're trying to destroy public education. But I think if you take off those lenses and you look at like what
it's the UEA, by the way. Sorry, UEA.
Okay. The UEA, yeah. I think if you take off that lens, I think it really is the legislators saying, hey, we are seeing some great outcomes from some of this innovation, and we want to send a clear message to the establishment that we're going to try to do some new things. Now, I think there's always a nefarious side to this too. I think you could also say that there's elements within the legislature that are just trying to grab power, and some of the things that they want to push forward are going to be hindered by the UEA. So I'll give you a case in point where interests could not be aligned, right? So I love the Utah Fits All scholarship. I think it's phenomenal in terms of how it's helped my wife and my kids and I build something that we really love and that we're going to try and spread and help serve more students who are struggling. However, is a large contract essentially with the administrator of the system. And we don't think about this often with education funding, but whenever you take tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars and you plop them into a fund that you're dedicating to education, you create all kinds of opportunity for the people who are in the right positions of power to make a lot of money from running these systems, running these programs. So in the case of the Utah Fits All scholarship, there's an administrative fee every time a scholarship payment goes out to a school, a micro school family. They're taking essentially a small tax. Now, if you do that over, let's say you have not just 10,000 students, let's say you have 100,000 students that you're giving a scholarship, and you're siphoning off, you know, these little taxes from every single student, that becomes this big pot of money that somebody is getting paid to administer this program. Now, this is happening all the time with the public system. And I think that's part of why teachers get wronged so much, because they're the actual, you know, they're supposed to be the beneficiaries of the union, but frequently they're unaware of the billions of dollars that are being put into these pots to serve the education system. But there's huge contracts going to people who are building expensive schools. There's huge contracts going to the policemen who are security interests for the schools. There's huge contracts going to the curriculum providers. There's huge contracts. And then that's not even talking about the administrators. And so for so long, I feel like we have blindly accepted that we should write blank checks to education. And the reality is, I got a pretty darn good education, K through 12, where my parents got $0. $0. I had access to a public library, a mom who read to me, and parents who taught me to love learning and to work hard. You know, and the reality is that we spend way more money than we have to on frivolous things in education.
Well, that is an understatement.
And so I think that, and the sad thing is, none of that, or the majority of that money, doesn't go to the people actually doing the work.
Right.
And so
to sum it up, though, would you say, I'm going to put you on the spot, are you a fan of HB 267? Do you like it?
I like that it is moving us into a more decentralized power structure in the education system. I'm concerned that there is opportunity, and that's with every bill. So I would say, like, if I had to give a percentage of like I like it versus don't like it, I'd be at like, I'm like 75% sure that it's a good
That's
thing.
pretty good.
But
Yeah, that's pretty good.
But I think there's a good chance that I could shift back to, oh, I don't, it really just depends on how the legislature handles the additional power, what they use.
And I guess I haven't looked into it much, so maybe they have specific things to address those concerns. I know that in the past, usually when like legislation like this goes through, there's a lot of like caveats and amendments
and I think that
maybe there is.
I think that by and large, anything that can empower changes to the system and entrepreneurship and look, you can still go as a teacher and you can bargain for a higher wage, right? You're just not doing it in a union. Nothing's stopping you from doing that. And also, I think maybe it'll incentivize more teachers to get involved in the entrepreneurship side. Go start your own local school or start a company that's tutoring or whatever the case.
Tell me if this is a good explanation, because this is how teachers unions were explained to me and just kind of how I've observed it. You have these unions that protect public employees, right? What happens is these guys get a ton of money from the people that they're protecting. They then use that money to get people elected who keep them in power. And so it's kind of like a revolving door where the people that get elected were elected by the teachers unions, and so they just never lose their jobs. So that means that bad teachers don't get fired. That means that there's very little entrepreneurship. There's a lot of stagnation.
There's a lot of opportunity with this legislation to get rid of some over the course of if this legislation stays in place for a couple cycles, right? We could see some major change in our representative bodies because the unions lose some of their lobbying power and some of their political sway, which allows people who are pushing for change in the system to get elected easier.
Would you say so? So you would say that's fairly accurate, that the teachers unions kind of keep things how they are?
Yeah, they're definitely, I think, protecting the status quo.
Yeah,
and protecting the financial interests of the public school system.
Right. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes that can butt up against the interests of actual students. And so I think that's what that bill is trying to do, is saying, you know what, we care more about the students rather than this specific organization.
As long as we feel like our school is doing a poor job, or on the flip side, it's doing a good. So if you're protecting the status quo, and the status quo for you and your neighborhood school is that my kids are getting what I want them to get, then you're not going to be a fan of this. On the flip side, if my kid is not getting what I wanted, you're not going to be a fan of this, right?
Right.
And that's where the 75-25 comes in, is I think I'm about 75% more for upheaval in the system and getting rid of the status quo and making changes. And I think as long as those changes don't tip the needle to a place that I think is bad for kids and bad for teachers, then I think it's a good thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I probably agree with you there, because I think that there does need to be some upheaval, but not so much that, like you mentioned, kids who wouldn't be able to have an alternative would still have a good place to land.
Well, and hopefully in the competitive marketplace of education, some of the things that my wife and I are creating will get pushed up to the legislature. That's my goal. Like I ran for state senate during that early period of starting Apex Garden, and I'll probably run for the legislature again at some point. But my goal is to take some of the good things that we're discovering and building and creating, get those to the legislature so that the legislature can push it into the public schools and make the school system work better, right? So I don't think it has to be this conflict. It can be, hey, we have some innovators who are figuring out things that work for today's students and with the new technology and We're gonna take the best of what they create. We're gonna give it to all the kids so that the system itself is elevated.
That's really exciting, and I think that's what HB 455 does. So this is, you mentioned this before, so we're just going to jump right into it. It's the Utah Fits All Scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, Representative Perucci, who I know, she's a great lady, from Harriman, the Utah Fits All students, 5 through 11 will be eligible to receive up to $4,000 a year for educational purposes. And those 12 to 18 years old will receive $6,000 per year. And then private school students are still eligible for $8,000 a year, the previous amount available to all. So I guess there's a little bit of change, but basically what this bill does, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but allows parents to choose where they want that tax money that they would have received in the public school system to go wherever they want. That could be a micro school, that could be homeschooling, that could be private school, that could be charter school. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Now, I have always been concerned. I don't know if you're familiar with some of the most passionate public school whistleblowers, I'll call them, in the state. And I don't always like, there are a few things that I sometimes think they're a little too extreme about, but Natalie Klein and Monica Wilbur, are you familiar with those gals?
I have not heard of them.
So they're both very, very active in kind of whistleblowing bad policy in education that's coming. So Natalie was on the state school board, and she actually was the one who got a lot of flack and was censured because she tweeted something about a girl that was on a basketball team, and she said, girl question mark. Anyway, it created this big firestorm in both the legislature and in the school board, and she was censured. But she and Monica have been working to just kind of pull back the curtain on a lot of these private interests in education that are pushing the transgender agenda and some of the stuff that's actually making its way into our classrooms to try and satisfy the federal lobby. So I bring them up because I'm like lost track. Where did we start with this?
Talking about how this money will be able to be used for whatever the parents decide.
Yeah. So we have always these gals who are aware of some of this really bad stuff that's coming down into the schools. They early on said to me, "Don't build a business model that relies on the Utah Fits All," because what they're concerned is that this is a way to come in and co-opt all the homeschooling that's going on. So you get people dependent on this money, and then after a few years, when everybody's relying on it for whatever system they're running, then they just attach the caveat: you need to have
LGBT.
You have to have this kind of testing, or you lose access to the funding. And so I think as it stands now, it's absolutely beautiful, and it's a tremendous benefit to entrepreneurs like myself, and to parents, and to folks who are trying to serve their students and their kids when they don't fit the public model, or they don't have access to a good public school, or whatever the case may be. Maybe their kid has special needs. And I think it's creating some tremendous change in a positive way. But I am cautious because I'm very real,
right?
Or I'm very, not pessimistic, but I'm a realist when it comes to,
whenever you take government funds, there are strings attached.
Yeah.
And so that could be a dangerous thing if the school board gets co-opted, which it very easily could.
Yeah.
But for right now, so it sounds like you are a fan of
yeah, my kids qualified for the scholarship, and it's been a huge blessing to us being able to run our micro school.
Well, to me, it just makes total sense that if I don't want to send my kid to a public school, but I have still been paying taxes for all my life, I should be able to take that money and say, well, I want to do this with it, and I should be allowed to. I love that idea. I'm kind of a crazy person that thinks maybe we shouldn't just be taxed very much at all, so we can do what we want with our own money.
No, I mean, I'm
this is a good solution. This is a good solution.
I just think the sad reality is that we've bloated government to the point where so few institutions and social functions can exist independent of government funding that we're just in this really bad pickle.
Yeah, so the genie's out of the bottle, so we just got to use our 3 wishes, and hopefully hopefully we can figure that out.
Well, and what I figure is I'll just keep trying to fight the political fight as I accept the tax money back to the private education I want for my kids, and hopefully we can keep those strings at bay, you know.
Right. So here's one that's really interesting to me. It's HB 260. It's with Val Peterson from Orem and Ann Milner from Ogden. It creates the first credential program for high school students and will provide opportunities for industry recognized credentials to be obtained before leaving high school. So not only will you graduate high school with your high school diploma, you'll be able to graduate with a credential saying, I know how to weld. I know how to fix a car. I know how to do X, Y, and Z that are industry recognized. So that way, less students have to be going and getting useless college degrees. Is that kind of how did I sum it up? Okay.
So I love this. And one of the big ideas, you know, that I've had with, if I got to the legislature and had my experience inform change in education, what I really think we should do with all of our public school facilities is turn them into hard science, manufacturing, and engineering and computer facilities, so that we're getting the benefit of that heavy infrastructure in a profitable way.
Right.
Because I think that's one of the biggest things that's so silly about education is we think, you know, we have to just pour money into education and get nothing out. Like the whole point is that to prepare young people to add and contribute to society, but we're not giving them the tools to do that because society has changed so much. So credentialing kids to weld or to manufacture or to, I think that's a great idea. It's a step in the right direction. And if we can get all of these facilities preparing kids for all the new jobs of tomorrow, we're building robots, or we're designing spacecraft, or we're creating chemical products that are going to heal cancer, whatever. Like kids are so much more capable than we give them credit for. And what are we doing right now? We're just warehousing them for 5 to 6 years at some of their peak creativity and then releasing them with no functional skills to go and try and survive in an environment where they have to make thousands and thousands of dollars a month just to
eat. And we want them to go to college where they can take 2 years of general education, which they already should have taken in high school, go into debt and get a degree that doesn't actually serve them. So I mean, it's insane.
I think that the flip side to this is that I don't want to see it like choke out the liberal arts and the arts in general. You know, I do think there's value to learning to read great works of literature and think deeply about the world, and to learn to use higher reasoning with mathematics, and I just think that we should be getting that exposure at an earlier age. I mean, in our micro school, my wife's doing such fun things in first, second, and third grade. They're introducing really deep topics, you know, and they're not asking the kids to have all the handwriting and the computation skills, but they're exposing them to calculus and to chemistry, and that's easy to do. You just give a young child a vocabulary rich environment, an opportunity to learn from the best books and conversation about the way that the world really works, and then you build their fine motor skills and their critical thinking and their computational skills to the place that by the time they're going into junior high, they could walk into a big building with laboratories and they could start, you know, designing and doing all this stuff. I went into the workforce at 14 years old. My mom and dad were really poor, and I was the oldest of 11 kids, and we didn't have hardly anything. And so I went to work at a big cattle company at 14 years old, and I was handling invoices, and I was running AutoCAD programs, and I was helping survey for construction projects, and that experience opened my world to how things really work in a way that I think all kids in that age group should be exposed. And I think the earlier you expose kids to
complex ideas and focus on them, the better off they'll be. So I'm really excited about this one. Another one they have is from my uncle, Senator Fillmore from South Jordan, SB 178. So Senator Fillmore says that the bill says no cell phones, smartwatches, or other devices will be allowed in schools. This bill will go into effect this summer.
Just since it's your uncle, I need to like point out the problem with this one.
Oh, please do.
No, I mean, I 100% think that the screen time. Oh, so I had a few months. We had a 14-year-old living with us. He was a family friend. He was in transition. He was adopted. He needed a safe place to be for a few months, and we facilitated that. And I saw immediately the number one problem in this poor kid's life was his smartphone, like on so many levels. The access to peer unsupervised peer communication is just dangerous for that age group.
Extremely. Not to mention the dopamine that you can just get
the addictive
in a way that you'd never be able to get anywhere
all
else.
of us are like coping with our dopamine addiction with our smartphones as adults, and we're aware of how damaging it is. So all of those things are so valid, and I agree. But here's the dark horse problem with this. There are some things happening in our public schools right now that phones provide an outlet for kids when they're in trouble at school, that they're now taking that away. So if you have a teacher that's starting to teach you things that make you really uncomfortable, or if you
can't pull out your phone and record it.
Well, you can't pull out your phone and record it. You can't call mom and dad and have them say, hey, something's happened. I wish it wasn't the case that there's never a situation in school where you might need to communicate to get out of that environment as a young person. But the reality is those things do exist. And so
maybe I'll have my uncle on my show and I'll ask him about it. I'll say, hey, there's this concern. What would you say? Because I'm sure that he's had that concern brought to him before.
Yeah. And I think we just need to, I think the answer to it is old school, high quality administration where principals and teachers and everybody in the system is making sure that what's supposed to happen in the classroom is happening in the classroom. And that but if we continue to have federal pressure to do the wrong kinds of things in our classrooms, and we have no eyes and no ears in any of those classrooms, that could create a really untenable situation.
That's interesting. I did not think about that before, because when I saw it, I just thought that's great. Because as a kid who, I went to high school and I had my phone, and I remember, so I graduated in 2015, and so phones and like smartphones didn't really become popular in school till like 2012, 13. So all of elementary school, most of my middle school, there was no phones. But I remember the year that phones were introduced into like the market that everyone could have them. And I remember walking into a classroom and everyone was just sitting there silently. And I couldn't believe it. Because every other time I'd walked into a classroom, kids were talking to each other, throwing paper airplanes, giving each other wedgies, grabbing each other's head, like just kind of going crazy,
do you know how
interacting. But then as soon as you put a screen in front of their face, it like
just there. Yeah.
It just dulls them down into just pure entertainment. And so
do we know how they're implementing the policy? Is there a smartphone or smartwatch kept at the front office or something like that?
I don't know how it's going to be enforced. I just got the notes right here. We could look it up.
I think that would be really interesting because, as long as a kid could get up and go get his phone from the office to make a call, like maybe that mutes my concern. I've really started to worry that we're pulling kids out of classes and taking them to the school counselor, or we're immunizing kids at school, or and I'm sure I'd have some of my teachers be like, Vaughn, you're crazy. Like none of this is ever going to happen. And they might be right in their school, but there are some schools in the state that I've heard just really bad stories about what's happening in the school. So.
Yeah, I'm looking at this ad right here from Deseret News, and it looks like they have like these little bags that they're going to give the students where they can put their phone in at the beginning of class or something like that. and then they can get it afterwards. So they
See,
can,
that to me is just a win-win all around. So if they're handling it that way, where it's not really disrupting the ability for the child to communicate externally if they need to, then I'm all for it. So
okay, yeah, I think it looks pretty good. I'm trying to find other things, but I guess
I guarantee you, my wife would never let a cell phone into our micro school during class time. Like, it's just
no, exactly, and it's so interesting that just we don't quite understand the psychology and the psychological effects that having a cell phone at a young age is causing, because it just hasn't happened. This is the first time in humans' history that people have been able to have a little screen in front of them that just entertains them constantly.
Yeah.
So what does that look like here in 10 or 15 years? What's our society going to look like? We don't know.
Well,
but I'm glad that we're kind of
have smart glasses so that we are never outside of our digital environment.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm totally in favor of this, and as it implements, I'm sure that we're going to get a lot of more stories, because it doesn't actually happen until.
Well, and I'll tell you what, the other thing is, some of these kids are going to go into shock. Like, they're so dependent.
Where's my phone? Where's my phone?
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
Which will be good. Which will be so good for them, so they can finally have their brains start working again, have that dopamine naturally come, instead of on TikTok watching stupid videos.
My other ambition in life, and this is, pie in the sky, but if I can get to a place financially where I can do it, I really want to go back to school and get a medical degree and study brain chemistry, because I had really serious chemical imbalances in my early 20s. I've gone 16 days without sleep, and my body produced so much adrenaline and dopamine that I just couldn't shut down for days on end.
That is
and
crazy.
So I'm very, because of those experiences, I was one of those few that had some really serious mental health situations that came out of it in a healthy and sustainable way. The fact that I was able to go through those kinds of really heavy dopamine-induced manias and still get to a place where I can graduate from college, graduate from law school, not have any of a lot of the trappings of dysfunction that come with mental illness, gives me insight to people who have schizophrenia. I've been in hospitals with people with all kinds of mental health disorders, and I really want to understand what we as a society can do to help some of those things. And so,
well, I think we're going to get a pretty good case study right now, because we're going to have the grades of students in the last 10 years where they've had cell phones. And then this next year, the school year is going to start. And then we could measure for the next 10 years the results of those school grades to see whether or not they're doing as well. And so I'm really excited. I think that's the one I'm most excited about, because I think that cell phones, while they have their uses, I think overall they've made our society more stupid, much more self-absorbed, and a lot more boring, because people aren't as creative as they used to be. So to wrap it up, we'll do the last bill. I skipped a couple bills just for sake of time. HB 77 is the flag display amendments. So Representative Trevor Lee from Layton prohibits a government entity or employee of a government entity from displaying a flag in or on the grounds of the government property except the U.S. flag, the Utah state flag, the official flag of another nation or state, a municipal or county flag, and military flags, including POW, MIA flags, Native American tribes, colleges, universities, so on and so forth. So this one obviously is just to get rid of the pride flag, and it's to get rid of Black Lives Matter flags, because those are the two that have been displayed all over the country, all over the state. And this is a way to get that crap out of our schools. I like this bill. What do you think?
I think it's great. And I think the reason it's great is because we just need to get back to the place where we're teaching kids how to think and not what to think. I mean, I'm running a micro school, and my wife and I both feel like it's not our place as educators to supplant a parent's responsibility to educate their child when it comes to sensitive topics that deal with sexual behavior and religion and politics. Like, it's just, those are family matters.
It seems so obvious to me. Like, a no-brainer. Like, duh, don't talk to kids about sex, you freaking weirdos. Especially the weird sex stuff that they're talking about. It's unreal.
And it's just sad that we've gotten to this place. And I think smartphones are a part to blame. I mean, there's no doubt that these smart teenagers are or late elementary school students, they're finding weird stuff. They're searching, it just becomes really toxic, and they don't need the burden of that. Like, you don't need the burden of trying to figure out your sexuality when you're in elementary school. You just don't. You learn how to think critically and learn to love reading great literature, learn how to think mathematically, and we just need to get back to that.
I totally agree. I think neutrality is a nice idea. Just having like public schools, just kind of, saying, I'm not going to get into this. I'm going to stay out of it. I think that's a nice idea. I think the problem is, however, with neutrality is that it can be weaponized against people who just want to send their kid to school, so that people can come in and say, well, they're just doing neutral stuff. I'm just going to throw some stuff in there. Right. So I don't know if I totally agree with the idea that we shouldn't teach kids what to think, because I still think that is really important. Like, you should be teaching kids basic things that, they should and shouldn't do. Like, I remember learning about the golden rule in my first grade class, and that was a lesson on morality. And then there's a lot of other states that are putting the 10 Commandments into the schools. And I would way rather have the 10 Commandments in schools saying, hey, you don't actually have to like believe in these things, but this is an important document that our society was built on, and here they are. I would rather have that.
I don't have any problem with fundamental ethics. I don't have any problem with teaching the golden rule or how to be canon. I think once you open the door to religion generally, like, it just gets too messy. It's a family topic. It's a family issue.
What would you say about the 10 Commandments, do you think?
I think that the 10 Commandments can be taught as a historical, a historical foundation of Western civilization and the U.S. Constitution, and there can be a history lesson there. But I think that if I were a teacher and I'm developing curriculum for, I don't know, a late elementary class that's going to include Western civilization, I'm going to say, hey, here are the Greeks, here are the Romans, here are the Gaelic peoples, here are the Israelites and the Hittites and some of our early colonizing peoples were Christian and they used the Bible, and there's the 10 Commandments. Some of our early peoples were Native American and they worshiped, an indigenous. Like, if you're staying neutral and you're not saying, hey, this is the religion that you should follow,
sure,
then of course, like, I don't have a problem in religious exposure. I just don't think it's the place of a teacher to push on a child, this is the way that they need to adopt their belief system around any given religion.
Sure, and you're not going to say you're going to go to hell if you don't do these, but I think that there should be, and maybe I'm just a crazy person who's, I don't think neutrality can exist. I think you need to have a positive vision. You can't just have no vision, because where there's no vision, someone else will come in and give you a vision, and that's what the trans lobby has done. That's what the Black Lives Matter movement has done. They've come into a society that's neutral and just overtaken it. So if we don't have a positive vision going forward, it's easy to be co-opted. So in my opinion, having the 10 Commandments up there, just saying, this is what our society was built on. The people who created this country were Christians. This is one of the most fundamental documents that they derived their meaning from. I'm not going to say you're going to go to hell or something like that, but that document right there is extremely important. And that's my opinion.
No, I respect your opinion, and I don't necessarily categorically disagree in any way. I tend to lean towards seeing a lot of nuance, and I have friends who are transgender, gay, lesbian, and I say friends loosely, like, I don't have really close associates that I spend a lot of time with, but I've met wonderful people. I was I was at BYU's campus, and it was really funny visiting there again. And this kid in the elevator, he's like, I'm a trans activist, and I'm also a communist, and like all these things. And if you spend time with some of these people and you really talk to them, even if you totally disagree, you recognize that like they're wonderful people. And it's just sad that we're in this place where we're taking any ideology that's food for thought for adults, and we're putting it into the realm of children.
Well, that's the argument that I'm making, is that because our schools have become a neutral ground, a place where you can't talk about any of this stuff, kids go in there and then they're easily taken over by these radical ideas.
So I would say just be a little more broad than just the 10 Commandments. Like
sure.
let's look at the what is it, the Rig Veda, the Quran. Like I don't want to.
I would argue that I wouldn't want to put the Quran in there. We don't have Muslim founders. Our country was not built on Muslim principles.
I don't mean putting it. I don't mean putting it on the wall. I just mean like giving kids a way to recognize that there are a lot of people and cultures and ideologies. And granted, I don't think it's really unfortunate we have really wonderful and kind and loving people who are pushing at a very early age for their children to adopt some of these things that are not healthy for them. And so I think that's where it just gets really
it is hard. Yeah, it is messy. But
the reason I push on this is because like I have had these conversations with people who believe they're binary or have
non-binary.
They're non-binary. They're in a lesbian relationship and they have their kids and they're raising them. And I don't think it's healthy or right for kids from those families to go into a public school and to be shamed or beat up or abused because the power structure of the school is this Christian ideology, and the part of the Christian ideology that's being zeroed in on is we're right, you're wrong, you're worthless,
I don't think anyone is pushing for that.
But there have been cases of that happening, and that's where it's so painful to recognize that. I mean, how do we really love each other without having these really difficult disagreements come head to head?
Yeah.
And I think
you just have to pick a side and push for that side. And if you pick no side, one side will be chosen for you, which is unfortunate because in the perfect world, I would want absolute neutrality. That's what I would want. I would want kids to go to school and not have to worry about any of this stuff. But clearly we're past that point. You have people who want to push their ideologies on kids, and they've been extremely successful doing it. So what do? We just sit back and do nothing. I think this bill is a good start. In my opinion, it doesn't go far enough, but I'm a crazy right-wing nut. But no, I really appreciate you coming on and kind of having the dialogue back and forth. Where can people go to get involved with what you do or resources that you might have for them?
So I have a political only website that is vaughnforutah.com. I just got it back up again. I'm there on the Capitol Hill saying a prayer at the top of the thing. And I try to just link a lot of resources there for people.
So are you running for Congress right now?
No, I ran for a state Senate, but I set this up as a pundit website. Is that live? Can you scroll up to the top? That's the bottom of the page.
Dwayne, can you scroll up? Yeah. Scroll all the way up to the top.
It went back down to the bottom, Dwayne.
I don't know what Dwayne is doing with his computer. Just scroll up. Up. Scroll up.
There you go.
There you go. There you are.
So like I said, I plan to run for office again. I'm just waiting until it's the right time. I want to get my law license, and I've realized that trying to run for office, trying to get barred, trying to run 3 companies and do it all is just not tenable. And so I'm trying to pick what I do, but I've maintained this website as an asset for when I do run again, and also as a place to just have my voice in the web to kind of augment some of the other voices that I'm here. So I put up KMMU stuff. I count down to different election things. I was a big supporter of Austin Hepworth. I helped run his campaign. He's one of the politicians that I respect a lot. I helped Phil Lyman's campaign. And then I've just got a lot of patriot friends that I try to get their voices out there. These people tend to be, you talk about being on the far right, radical, whatever, like I've met so many of these people who would be considered radical far right people, and I don't buy it. I just think they're tired and they're fighting really hard.
That's
it. And the thing is I think that's hard for me, is that like I also have these friends who are on the far left, and I love both. And I see some of the value to different parts of their perspectives on both sides. And so, and I'm not trying to just be a wishy-washy in the middle person. If I'm hammered down on a policy position, I'll stand up for the thing that I think is right. And I was very clear. I think that getting those flags out of the classroom is the right call.
Yeah.
I just don't want to swing so far to the right that we're activating hatred for the left,
Yeah. And I think there is definitely a worry for that, where if the pendulum goes so far this way, that we have a tendency to want to bring it all the way back over here, which then gives power back to these. So it's like, it'd be better to have it in the middle. I totally agree with that. And I would say naturally, I'm actually a very moderate person, but I've just been pushed too much. Yeah. And it's like, I cannot keep going.
One of the things that got me into the political arena in terms of like, why did I run a Senate campaign, is that I was running a business with kids in COVID, and they were telling us to mask kids in daycare centers and mask kids in gymnastics gyms. And I just wouldn't do it. And I said, I'm going to get on the stump, and I'm going to start telling our politicians, get out of our schools, get out of our businesses. Like, this is not healthy for us. And now we've seen so much of the science proven wrong. The science, like all the propaganda that we were told during COVID was such a lie, and we were being abused as a society. We were being manipulated, and I wasn't willing to take it. So I stood up during that period. And then I realized we just need people who are willing to fight for the next generation, but do so in a loving and kind way to everybody in our society, to sort of stand up and run for office. And so that's what I'm going to continue to work towards once I've got all my ducks in a row.
Awesome. Well, one last time, you're listening to us live on KMMU Mainstream Media Utah. You can find us on YouTube, Rumble X, and our website, kmmu.org. Give us a call before we run out of time. You can ask Vaughn any question that you want. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. Ask him about homeschooling, ask him about education, ask him about his beard, ask him about living in the mountains, whatever you want to ask him.
And Dan, if folks want to reach me, if they watch this after the fact, they can go to that website that we.
So it's Vaughn for Utah.
Yep, there's a spot for them to email me. There's actually a chat bot that's on there. They can chat with me. So I'm happy to.
That's VAUGHN for Utah.com, right?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, it'd be great for anybody who sees this to get involved. I think that education is one of those things that, I mean, I can't think of another issue that's more important to the future of our state and the future of our country than training and teaching and imbuing values into the youngest generation. And you don't have to send your kid to a public school anymore. There are plenty of options now because of the great state of Utah. We've realized that you can homeschool, you can do private school, you can do all these different things. And there's incentives for you to do so with cold, hard cash that you paid into the system to begin with. So there's tons of advantages you can take.
Get involved in pushing that. My micro school is relocating to Weber County. So if you're a Weber County listener and you want to get connected and work on some of these issues together, I'd love to talk with you. So
Yeah, Vaughn is a great resource. He's got all the answers, and this is really the start of something awesome for the state of Utah. And I hope that we can look back on these years and we compare them with the last 10 years and say, wow, this is where Utah started to really come back and to lead the whole country and the whole world.
I love that vision, Dan, and that's what I'm hoping to. Let's make these changes together. Thanks for having me on and taking the time to answer questions.
Well, I think that you are going to be doing great. I think you're going to be the reason, a big part of the reason is if we do get things back on track, that you're going to be a catalyst for that. So we really appreciate what you do. Again, it's vaughnforutah.com, and you can get involved with Vaughn Hokanson. And we didn't get any calls during the last little bit, so we'll just go ahead and end. Thank you so much, Vaughn. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Dan. Great to get to know you better.